Hi, everyone. I will just go ahead and get started if that works. Just give it 1 minute. Okay. Welcome, everyone. I'm really glad and excited to be here today and really appreciate the opportunity. So thank you, Cyberjutsu. My name is Liz Green. I'm an occupational therapist, and I've been an OT for 20 years. So I actually don't have any cybersecurity experience. I am coming at this from a very different lens. I have worked with clients, thousands of clients over the course of the years, who have what we identify as neurodistinct or neurodiverse conditions, hidden conditions like autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and more. And I started doing business consulting a couple years ago because I was seeing this incredible talent, either not getting into jobs or not keeping jobs, which is what led me down this path. And then I started moving into talking with people at Cybersecurity, especially NICE. I do a lot of work with them, really trying to educate around the fact that there's a lot of neurodiversity within cybersecurity, and there needs to be more done in terms of creating neurodiversity inclusive workplaces across the employee life cycle. So I am excited to chat about neurodiversity and gives hopefully some good takeaways. I am not the best at checking the chat throughout, so probably take some questions definitely at the end, and we should have time for that. But feel free to plug them in at any point. So this is the agenda. We're going to be talking about neurodiversity. I'm going to be defining it in a little more detail, the social model of it versus the medical model, looking at the business case for hiring people who think differently, looking at organizational neurodiversity, what companies should be doing, and touching on topics like disclosure, inclusion, association with employee burnout, and current programming out there. And then I'm going to talk through some key takeaways, how you could get started as a team member, yourself, if you identify as being neurodistinct, an HR manager or a manager. So, and then I'll have some survey questions. So a lot of people have heard the term, I think, neurodiversity. There's sometimes confusion around the variance in terminology, but the term neurodiversity was coined by a sociologist in the 90s named Judy Singer. And she actually identifies as autistic, and she relates neurodiversity as the natural variations in the way that humans think and act. So very much akin to biodiversity. Just as there's differences between plants and animals, so too is there differences between people. So in that sense, we are all neurodiverse because we all think differently. What you hear about within the movement, though, is this idea of, if you were to kind of map out people's skills, the way they process, the way they interact on a bell curve, you would see a greater density of certain populations that fall in the middle. In medicine, we call them neurotypical, basically greater grouping of similarities. And then on the edges, you tend to see what we call more spiky profiles of individuals who have felt less understood by society. And so the movement stemmed out of this idea of society needs to change. Instead of designing everything for the norm, it's time to consider other perspectives. And the focus is really on skills and strengths versus deficits, which is very common in medicine. So what I talk a lot about and what is out there, if you Google neurodiversity in the workplace, what you see is that the greater diversity of talent, the more innovation, and then the greater ROI at the end of the day. And so, like I mentioned, here's that bell curve of, if you look at people who, if you were to kind of map out skills and interactions and emotions across a spectrum or graph it out, you would see a greater density of more similarity thinking people in the middle, and then the more divergent tendencies on the edges, which is what that chart displays. So I touched on the medical model, but I kind of like to differentiate it, especially because with my background in medicine, I think that medical people have a long way to go. If you think about, say, if you were to Google ADHD and you look up a diagnosis, what you see is a list of deficits. There's very much a focus on cure and prevention. And there's generally an emerging awareness of neurodiversity within medicine, probably because there's more ambiguity and medical people tend to be very concrete. And then also the focus is more like person first language, like the person with the condition, the person who has autism, the person with ADHD. Now, within the neurodiversity movement, it's really focused on the skills and strengths that a person brings to the table because of their condition. And it describes the differences between and within individuals, and it views diagnoses as conditions or differences rather than disorders. And the other thing too is it's an identity first movement. So a person would say, I am autistic just as I am tall. It's part of who they are. I'm an ADHDer, I'm dyslexic. And I see this a lot, especially with Gen Z audiences, is that, that's become a much more commonly accepted way of thinking. Is like, there's nothing to be embarrassed about, to hold back on. This is who I am, which is great to see. So this graphic shows the difference too, in kind of a simplified way of, like, in medicine, the impairment, the person in this wheelchair, for example, well, they need to fix themselves to get up the stairs. It's kind of the view. Within the social model of disability, it's, well, actually, no, the environment needs to change a bit. The stairs are the problem. They need to build a ramp, which is really powerful in my mind. And what I tell companies and groups that I'm talking to is that at least 20% of the population right now is neurodistinct. And actually, if you were to add up these statistics, you'd see a greater number, but that's kind of the conservative estimate that's been accepted within the movement. And so then it's thinking about, this isn't just the matter of, oh, I knew somebody once who had something that was different. This is people in my family, people's in my team, myself, like, neurodiversity is among us. So we need to start thinking differently about kind of our assumptions and the way that things are done, especially in the workplace. I like this graphic. It's not an exhaustive list of neurodiversity or neurodiverse conditions. There is no diagnostic qualifier. You don't have to have a diagnosis to say, I see myself as neurodistinct or neurodivergent. It's really the feeling of misunderstood versus not. But what I like about this is when it spells out different conditions like ADHD, what it's talking about here is the skills that come forward, like creativity, hyperfocus, energy, and passion. You don't see anywhere on here a deficit. Even, a person with depression, or anxiety, there's a greater likelihood of increased depth of thinking, tendency, to kind of really seek to process information, which is a great skill for work. So that's a good thing to kind of note here with this graphic. And then, the other ones, there's many, many more that aren't on this list. And then you can see the overlap too, because, the other thing with neurodiversity is that generally, especially if we're looking at different conditions, you don't just see, one person who has ADHD maybe, and then there's nothing else. There's a blend, right? It's a very fluid thing of like, oh, maybe there's some anxious symptoms along with ADHD, but like they all kind of go hand in hand, and every person is different. And that's another really important thing to state, is that if one person who's neurodistinct, one person. And so making assumptions because a person has a condition is definitely the opposite, the wrong way to go. And really, this is about asking questions to understand who each unique individual is. So when we're talking about cybersecurity, and really what led me down the road of doing more work in this space is that, well, one, there's recruitment and retention problems, we know. And so there's a lot of energy around how do we design differently? How do we recruit a diverse workforce? But also there's a greater correlation of the unique skills that are sought after in cybersecurity and many neurodiverse conditions. So a lot of people who have these really, and there are many more, but these are some of the top skills that are sought after in cybersecurity, you might see a greater likelihood of a neurodiverse condition. So I'm going to move into the business case for neurodiversity. And, these are several different institutions, very reputable groups that have talked about the strength of having a neurodivergent workforce. One of my partners is Vanderbilt University's Autism Innovation Center. They've seen increased innovation with autistic workers. Microsoft and SAP. So actually SAP they've started a lot of the hiring programs out there around autism and other neurodiverse conditions. SAP started one in 2013. And the idea with these large companies is they saw that there is a business case of seeking people out who think differently. So they created a hiring program where they would hire small pools of applicants in who identified as autistic, surround them with support as they were brought in, job coaching and so on, and then wean the support over time. And I'm going to talk about, obviously there's some good in that, and that, yes, they're seeing a business case, but there's also some challenges, which is what I've speak to a lot when I talk to companies. Alternauts is one of my partners. I'm going to be talking through them as a case study. They're seeing that their group basically they designed for the idea of neurodiversity within their company, and they were outperforming the competition by almost 60%. So, and what I'm really pushing within the conversations that I have with companies is the idea of designing for differences, knowing that, yes, you've got a high percentage of neurodiversity within your workforce. Instead of hinging everything in terms of accommodation on disclosure, why don't you just design for the fact that you already know that you have differences within your teams? And so, for example, one of the best practices that I've talked about with people is like, well, could everybody who wants accommodations have them during the interview process? No disclosure required, just like, hey, do you need anything? There are other, if I'm thinking about interviewing, things like providing the LinkedIn profiles of the people that will be doing the interview with the applicant, telling them, these are the questions we're going to ask. These are the breaks you can have. Do you need more? Even things like, hey, really, let's break down this job description. Does this job require a lot of back and forth interaction? And if it doesn't, could we just have the person showcase their skills instead of have to talk about them in this very high stress environment of interviewing? Closed captioning during all meetings. Sorry,
Hey, Liz, can you show the full screen of your slides? Because all we're seeing is your presentation mode.
Are you serious?
Does that make sense?
Are you serious?
Yes, ma'am. I was trying to get your attention in the chat.
Oh, gosh. Okay. So what do you see now? Are you seeing me click through slides?
So I see no, ma'am. So what I'm looking at, you may have multiple screens, or you may just have one screen. But what you're showing to the audience is your presenter view that has like the survey question, the list of slides on the left, but it's not showing as you advance.
That is really weird. I'm trying to figure out, I guess I'll pause share and then.
Right. So when you share your screen, you may have to go like full screen and then share from there.
Okay, I'll try that. Maybe that's the problem.
Or hide the presenter mode.
And where do I? Wow, this is really bad. Where's the presenter mode?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was trying to get your attention. Let's see here. Slideshow. Hit that. Yeah, hit that. Let's see. I don't know why my mouse is like. I'm just kind of playing. Yeah, do that drop down there.
I'm just kind of playing. There. Yeah. Okay. It must have been.
I had it. Perfect. Thank you, ma'am.
I had it hooked. The problem was I had it hooked into another monitor. So I'm sorry about that.
Awesome. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah. Sorry.
No problem.
So you guys heard me. I'm not going to reinvent. I'll just kind of show what I was talking through. This is the neurodiversity definition. The ROI for diverse hiring. There's the bell curve that I was talking about of like more divergent in thinking versus less, kind of neurotypical. the medical model versus social, and the graphic around looking at the medical model of disability, the impairment's the problem, versus the social model of, wow, they need to fix the environment. This is the 20% stat. And so you can see the numbers add up to higher than 20%, but this is the conservative accepted value within the community. This graphic shows the strengths of conditions versus the deficit. So like ADHD, having creativity, hyperfocus, energy, and passion, and so on. And as well as many other conditions showing the strength there: autism, concentration, fine detail processing, memory, analytical skills, problem solving. There's many there. These are some of the top skills that correlate with neurodiverse conditions that are sought after in cybersecurity. So you know that there's neurodiversity among all of us in the teams, but probably a higher concentration within this particular field. And then the business case, where I was talking through SAP and Microsoft, HP, they did a hiring program in Australia. They were seeing 30% greater productivity with their neurodivergent hires. Israel and Australia specifically recruit autistic talent for their cybersecurity teams. And then this is the designing for differences part of, say, accommodations for all, closed captioning during meetings, flexibility, even thinking about, does a person have to work if they don't function best with a 9-to-5 schedule? Can there be flexibility there? So, and this is where it's thinking about, like, what are the jobs and tasks that need to be done, as well as meetings? Like, when is it that it's needed that people are working at the pace of somebody else versus not? So can we be flexible within that realm? And this is the impact across the employee life cycle. So what you tend to see is when you start to design for different, you see an improved perception of the company based on reduced unconscious affinity or offer bias. You see a reduced cost to hire, a broader talent pool, reduced training spend due to planning for all needs instead of some. So we're kind of removing the stereotypes and kind of thinking about, well, we only have a few people that might be thinking this way, so we're only going to design this way. That's not accurate. And then looking at retention and career development improvements. And within cybersecurity, there's a lot of information out there really indicating the untapped potential of individuals who are neurodivergent. Kat Contillo is part of WESIS and a leader in the space, and even senior leaders like the CISO of Bank of America has been quoted as saying that there's a greater advantage to using neurodistinct talent to solve complex cybersecurity problems. So this case study, I mentioned the name Ultranauts. A lot of people haven't heard of them, but I always like to talk through them. They are a software bug detection company. They probably have around 100 employees, and the company was designed to recruit and hire neurodivergent candidates. Doesn't mean that if you're neurotypical, you can't work there, but they basically designed around the idea of, we want people who think differently here because we see the business case. And so this is kind of current state, although it is a couple years old with the loneliness score. You can see pretty high loneliness scores in the US, a lot of people wanting a more diverse workforce, a lot of people planning to leave. And Ultranauts, basically these are the 4 major tenets. They wanted inclusive business practices, the focus on team well-being, transparency, flexibility, and these are their outcomes. So they had top line growth of 70%. That was even during COVID times. Their loneliness score is less than half of the US. They had 50% growth per year. They are outperforming the competition by almost 60%. And you can see that when you're paying attention to differences in thinking and you're recruiting that, you're actually going to hit a lot of other groups who may feel marginalized, such as LGBTQ, people who used to live in poverty. So you can see these stats here increase across the board. And that's one of the other things I tell companies is, if you just view neurodiversity in a silo, you're missing the mark, because differences in thinking spans every group. In fact, at a higher density with certain groups, that are marginalized than others. So you really need to think about that with your design and your recruiting and hiring and retention. So I have a survey here. I'm hoping at least this works. So if you guys can scan the QR code, and I'll pull up the question, just giving it a second. And this first question is, what makes you stay at your job? So this is, I always like to kind of see what my audience thinks about things. Whoop. It went back before showing. And if it's not, I'm not sure why it's not showing here. You can always type this in the chat too. So we'll just move forward. I'm not sure why that's not working right now. So current state, I mentioned SAP and other companies, there's this focus on hiring and recruitment a lot of the time. Usually then the company will bring in a small group of neurodivergent hires. They do require disclosure. So everything sort of hinges on disclosure there. And what they've seen is that although that's a great start, that there's been scalability and sustainability issues. And also there's not a great number of metrics that are taken to show like the effectiveness long-term. What I really push against is this kind of continued focus on disability of like, you've got the small pool hired in, and then you've got the rest of the employees. And really the thought is, well, you've already got neurodiversity within your company. So what about the rest of them? In fact, I have one of my senior advisors who works at a very large company was indicating that when they did a hiring program, and he's part of the actually autistic ERG at his company. And they had stated, well, nobody's paying any attention to us, you know, like what's going on here. So I think the other thing too is with neurodiversity education and neurodiversity inclusive design, with a workshop such as what I'm doing, this is a really great start. This is an awareness building activity. But I think it's also important to really differentiate, okay, now what's the next step after this? Because people have peaks and valleys of learning. You learn good information, but you have to learn like, okay, what's the next step? How do I apply this? Where do I start? And so that's where I think it's really important to leverage external and internal resources and really develop an infrastructure around designing for different. The other thing too is that, you know we have a high number of workforce who has either identifying as a disability or neurodivergent, but only 3% of the workforce discloses. And so it is important to look at disclosure of why people don't disclose. A lot of people over age 35, especially if we're talking about neurodivergent conditions, are unaware. They may never have gotten a diagnosis because especially like ADHD and autism, those are much more commonly given diagnoses these days versus like when the people who are over age 35 were younger. And, like one of my colleagues, my senior advisor, Tim Goldstein, he works at Google in cloud and he's autistic. And he stated he got diagnosed at age 54. And he said, before that, I thought everybody was stupid, which I think is pretty hilarious as well. But also it doesn't matter how inclusive your company is. If you have had a negative experience in the past around your diagnosis, it's really hard to want to share. And I think that's also important to think about, like, there's a lot of trauma behind diagnoses and sharing. And the stigma of disability is there, whether we like it or not. And a lot of my clients that I see really talk about masking as kind of how they function of like, I have to hold back who I am authentically in order to fit into societal expectations. And what does it lead to? It leads to burnout. And so I think too, if we're talking about the high burnout rate in cybersecurity, it's something to think about here. There's an overlap here of people not necessarily getting the work kind of set up that they need, the flexibility that they need, the hours that they need. And then that ties into this problem long-term with like apps, like actually being able to last at the job. So these are stats from Cornell that indicate the importance of psychological safety to disclosure. And, the thing too is that the employee manager relationship is absolutely crucial to disclosure. And if a person feels I'm not going to be accepted for this, my manager doesn't trust me, doesn't appreciate me, I don't feel that I belong, there's a very high chance they're not going to share anything. So when I talk about where do you start, I think employee manager relationships are really, really crucial to focus on creation of psychological safety. And the key questions that I tell company leaders to ask themselves is, one, yes, we want a more diverse talent pool, but we also need to figure out how do we support our current staff, neurodistinct or not? And then how do we create a culture where people want to stay? And so the other thing is there's the challenge here. We know we want to hire diverse individuals, but we also, if you go through the kind of traditional one size fits all disability hiring training, sometimes you can then have hiring backfires where, you know, managers are saying, okay, we want to hire people who think differently, but then they bring them in and the person doesn't participate in groupthink. They push back, they think outside the box. What does it lead to? It can lead to conflict. And so it's really important that the managers and the teams are set up for success. It's a lot more than just saying, we want to hire diverse people. It's also thinking about, well, what does that mean that we need to do as a group to be more accepting? Because and this is also moves into this kind of culture fit versus ad phenomenon. Like a lot of HR individuals are learning more and more about this, but the tendency in traditional workplaces is hiring people who think similarly to you. You're going to be more likely to do that. One, because it's less risky, right? You know that they'll fit in socially, things like that. The culture ad hire, which I think is really important, especially in this field, is thinking about, well, we know we need people who will innovate because we've got to catch vulnerabilities. We have to maintain a strong security posture. So then you want to hire more diverse because you want to challenge groupthink, but you also have to be set up for success to make sure that you can support differences in thinking. And what we see too is that when you have old culture ad hires, you tend to see less pressure over time, less competition, less homogenous thinking, less masking, and you see an increase actually in disclosure, psychological safety, innovation, and productivity. So what I also like to just add to with people is like, how can you start as a team member, as a coworker, as a manager, as an HR professional, as a friend, even as an organization. And so thinking about, well, starting the conversation is really important. You know, creating a safe space, managers being vulnerable, like if it's once a week, hey, we're just going to connect and just chat and like be real. And this is not about fixing anything. You know, if somebody shares this is challenging for me, it's not, well, you should try da 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 da, but more, oh, tell me about that. And what else are you feeling? Oh, you know what? I felt the same thing the other week. It's just opening up the dialogue is really, really important. Seeking out, you know, respecting terminology requests. One of the hospitals that I worked at, they had pronoun pins for all the staff. If you wanted them, that's a good start. Lead by example, find common ground, you know, ask questions. It's really important as a starting point. From within the movement, it's also looking at how do we make events more accessible. What I really like about this particular event is the option of virtual versus in person. I love that there was, you know, the sensory breaks built in and things like that within this particular event. So that's great if we're thinking about mental health, designing for the idea that there's going to be people who think differently. And then also looking at, so for example, communication comes in a lot of different forms for people. So if you were to say, well, that person shouldn't get hired because they weren't really good at eye contact or they were kind of awkward. Well, you're boxing out talent. What we need to get at is what are they good at, their skills? And is there different ways where we could, if they communicate in kind of a less traditional way, where we could still foster them to be able to participate, you know, such as like if it's a manager meeting, can you have cameras off for those? You know, the person can join virtual, or even if it's, hey, let's go outside and take a walk and chat versus having to sit and stare at each other. You know, email preferences versus verbal preferences, sharing in the chat, Slack, whatever. So all of those things are important of how do we obviously you have to look at each task that's needed. I mean, there's certain tasks where it's just got to be an in-person interaction, maybe customer facing, but others don't always have to be. And when I talk to managers in HR, it's also really important to look at every stage of the employee life cycle. So from a recruitment perspective, what does your website look like? What do the job descriptions look like? Where are they even? Like, are they hard to find? Because that can box out talent. How clear is the application process? One big practice that's used a lot is job fairs. Now, there's nothing wrong with them, but that's an extremely anxiety-provoking situation for many people to have to go to a job fair and kind of be front and center and have people looking at them and asking questions. So there's some other practices I've seen out there, like reverse job fairs. Stanford did one where it's basically flipping it and having the virtual option of employers can come to candidates virtually and talk through in groups. So taking some of the pressure off, even things like, a person being able to apply online and do some sort of recording of themselves to send in to talk through, like, what is it we really need to get from you verbally versus something else. Hiring. Ultranauts, that company I mentioned, they do a technical assessment plus showcasing skills plus an interview as a way of interviewing. Accommodations for all, break times, onboarding. I didn't mention the biodex, but that is a best practice that Ultranauts created, which is basically a user manual for every person who works at that company. So any person who signs on, it'll ask questions like, how do you prefer feedback? When do you like downtime? This and that about you. And every team member in the company is responsible for reviewing each other's biodex to kind of understand differences and preferences. One thing Ultranauts does, which is very innovative, is they have a desired time equivalent versus a full-time equivalent. So they trust their employees to say, hey, you got this amount of your task, your job to do. You decide how long that's going to take you. I'm not going to watch how many hours you're working. You decide. But I will obviously hold you to your productivity expectations. And then also just being very transparent on, how do I move up in this position? Maybe a person doesn't want to move up. So then how do they stay engaged within the company related to career advancement? Being very objective. The more objective and transparent people can be with their practices, the better. All right, so I'm going to skip that part. You can put this in the chat. Where would you like to start? So maybe you have an ERG, employee resource group, through your company that's neurodiversity related. That's a great starting point. Maybe you don't, in which case learning more about neurodiversity on your own could be a thing. Joining groups. There's a lot of different groups, especially in larger cities, but I mean also virtually. Or learn about it with your team. And that could involve leveraging external supports. That's kind of something that I do quite a bit. So you can think about, is there anything that you might take interest in doing? And then the last question is thinking about your company. And you don't even have to respond. These may just be points for you to think about as next steps. Like, where should we start? Should we think about how to be more flexible? Should we have a safe space maybe? Should we look at policies and procedures? Should we have a manager training, or should we survey? There's a lot of different starting points that can be helpful. Everything is the start. And then this is just kind of an overview of what my company's working on. We're doing a lot in the partnership space with nonprofits. Like, we're going in on an NSF grant with WESIS and SANS to design neurodiversity inclusive apprenticeship programs. And we have another grant opportunity. We're going in on CISA grant with ISC Squared and CyberSN. So we're really focused a lot on the cybersecurity space and figuring out ways where we can educate and get more employers bought into this idea of designing for different and piloting and things like that. So if you have any interest in chatting outside of this, I would be happy to chat about, opportunities. If you feel like you yourself or your company, you would like to be talking more about neurodiversity, also very happy to chat. And I really do appreciate your time. I'm really sorry about the slideshow issue. That's, yeah, me not understanding tech pretty much. So I'm going to look in the chat now. And is there any questions? I see here many fear.
Great presentation. Yeah, great presentation. I
Sure.
would like to see more CEOs and C-suiters beyond HR,
Yeah.
connected and advocates and allies for
Yeah.
neurodiverse. And I think a lot of us have family members or even personally are undiagnosed, and that would go a long way to be more inclusive and not exclusive. And even how we even refer to it is, it's not a disability, it's an opportunity.
Yeah. Well, within your where you work, I would guess I'd ask you, Victor, are you in like a leadership position or other?
No, I'm a business development exec within a large multinational company,
Mhm.
and we have the employee resource group. So that's another good idea that I'll take back to our HR team.
Yeah, that's great. You know, one thing, because you were talking about C-suite, there was a former CEO of Xerox, actually, that I was talking to about neurodiversity. And I do think this is an interesting conversation because she said, being transparent, there's a lot of noise coming, like ERGs, people asking for things. We know we need to do that, but that, we have our own unique pressures. Like, are we just supposed to say yes to everything? Where do we start? And I said, I don't think it's necessarily that you have to say yes to everything. It's more that people feel safe enough to just ask you, to have conversations. And if they don't, like if you're saying, oh, I have open doors policy and nobody shows up, that's kind of a problem, right? But I would want to know your perspective on that too, because I think it's like, well, how do you start? And that's where, maybe somebody in your position saying like, I'm going to go back and talk to ERGs, all of that is great. But it is so crucial to have senior leader buy-in. Like you said, I mean, I have not seen, I know with the hiring programs like SAP and Microsoft and all of those have done it. That's one of the first kind of statements they state is from a strategy perspective, C-suites have to be sponsoring and buying into this.
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of employee resource groups do have the sponsor, who is a member of the C-suite, and that's where they have the executive leaders that talk about, well, what are you doing above and beyond the profit and loss? What are you doing on the human capital side? And that's part of their scorecard.
That's great. That's really great. I'm looking through some of the comments here. Many fear being singled out or not viewed as capable to be put in for advancement. Many workspaces are more politics than ability driven at times. Definitely. Is there, because like I said, I'm not a cybersecurity professional, but has anybody seen, maybe it's within their company or in the community, some practices starting where you're like, oh, I like this. There's a change happening. And if so, would you be okay with talking about them? So maybe that it's so great that it's hard to talk about, or maybe it's not. I'm not sure what that indicates, but no problem. This other person, Muriel, Mickey, Scott, saying, this is something I think my workforce within our federal government need more education on. Definitely. Yeah. So, and I would say the one thing with ERGs is it's a really great starting point, but what I really push for is the idea of there's got to be a move towards systems change, even if you're starting from full systems change and working backwards of like, if the group is just meeting and they don't have influence and they can't kind of push towards like, hey, you know, maybe we want some manager training, or we need to do this workshop, or we need to, you know, we want more employees involved, and there's somebody listening and saying, let's do it, then change doesn't really happen. And I pitch a lot off the idea of starting with pilots, starting with small groups, of saying, okay, if we're in a huge organization and we can't just boil the ocean and do everything, could we start small? Like, could we think about changing some recruiting practices within one unit and seeing what happens if you measure over time? And it's a little easier to implement. It doesn't take as much effort. So that's just kind of a thought. I've seen change in conferences where more and more, yeah, they have a chill room. That's great. Yeah, and I mean, that's the thing too, is I'm like, oh, conferences are doing this. Can't they do this in workplaces more? And I mean, you know, companies are engaging with different remote therapy providers like BetterUp and others, which is a great start. I always try to flip it though to like, solutioning around this isn't just providing therapy for people, it's also figuring out, well, what's causing the problem. So like, if people aren't feeling included and burning out, maybe we need to look at that a little bit more. So that's the kind of looking the other direction a little bit and seeing like, what should we be doing more of is always really important. So are there any other thoughts or questions? Yeah, I definitely appreciate everyone's time, and enjoy the rest of your conference. And like I said, feel free to email me after with any questions or follow up. Thank you very much.